This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive into U.S. foreign policy. This one's going to be interesting. We're looking at 1933 to 1941, a really critical time.
Oh yeah, a time of huge change.
The world's kind of teetering on the edge, right? Hitler's gaining power. And America, well, after World War I, they're like, nope, we're staying out of this. Isolationism was the mood.
It really was.
And you gave us some great sources to dig into. We got that podcast episode from Mr. Hutchings.
Yeah. The U.S. responds to events in Europe after 1933. Isolationism or internationalism. Quite a mouthful.
It is. Sounds like he's going deep, aimed at those IB history students.
Definitely.
And we've also got that Spotify audio, the U.S. path from isolationism to involvement in 1933-1941. So much to unpack. The big question is, how did the U.S. manage to stay out of Europe's mess while also realizing that Nazi Germany was, well, a big problem?
It's tricky. After WWII, Americans were just done with war.
Yeah, they saw the devastation. Plus, the Great Depression was hitting everyone hard.
Exactly. Survival was the priority. And if you look at the polls from back then, most Americans thought Europe's problems were, like, a world away, not our concern.
So Congress was basically reflecting what the people wanted.
Right.
Staying out of it.
Throughout the 1930s, yeah, isolationism was the dominant policy.
And then you have FDR, elected in 33. He personally believed in working with other countries, but the mood back home was totally different. Must have been a tough spot for him.
It was. On one hand, you have this huge pressure to avoid another war, both from the public and from Congress.
Right.
But on the other hand, he's seeing what Hitler's doing, and he's worried.
Plus, he's got the New Deal going on, trying to fix the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that needed Congress to be on board. Alienating them would have been a disaster for the New Deal.
So his options were limited when it came to foreign policy. And then we get the Neutrality Acts.
Yep, those come in between 1935 and 1937.
Basically, America saying, don't drag us into this.
Precisely, the embodiment of isolationism. In 1935, they banned selling weapons to any country at war. Straightforward.
Keeping their hands clean.
Then in 37, they add that cash and carry thing, so countries could buy stuff from the U.S., but only non-military goods.
And they had to pay cash. No credit.
Exactly, and they had to transport it themselves.
Which, as the Spotify audio points out, actually helped countries like Britain and France.
Yeah.
Right? They had the ships.
It did. Interesting how historians see these Neutrality Acts, though.
Yeah, you've got different schools of thought on this.
You've got the Orthodox school, like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. They see Roosevelt as being, well, cautious.
Knowing he couldn't push for intervention too hard.
Right. The public wasn't ready for it.
And then there's the revisionists, right? Like Charles Bennett. Totally different view.
Yeah, they argue that the U.S. was looking out for its own interests. They believed that past wars only benefited the rich folks, the bankers, and industrialists.
So they were trying to prevent that from happening again. A bit cynical, but interesting. But even with all this going on, Roosevelt wasn't just sitting around, was he?
No, not at all. He tries to nudge things along.
Like the quarantine speech in 1937.
A bold move. He basically says we need to quarantine these aggressive nations.
He didn't name names, but everyone knew who he meant, right? The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan. It's like he was testing the waters, seeing how far he could go.
Yeah. It didn't really work. Americans still weren't ready to get involved. Too strong, that isolationist feeling. And this is where you get those post-revisionists coming in.
Okay, so we have the Orthodox school, cautious Roosevelt, the revisionists, protecting U.S. interests. What about these post-revisionists? What's their take?
Well, historians like William Leuchtenberg, they saw Roosevelt as skillfully balancing things. Domestic concerns on one side, worries about Europe on the other.
So trying to keep everyone happy, but also preparing for the possibility of having to, step in.
Exactly, and all this is happening while Europe's getting more and more unstable.
Let's walk through some of those events. 1933, Hitler comes to power. 1936, he marches into the Rhineland, breaks the Treaty of Versailles. Big red flags, but I guess a lot of Americans still thought, Europe's problem.
Yeah, and that attitude kind of continues during the Spanish Civil War from 36 to 39. A lot of Americans sympathized with the Republicans fighting Franco.
But the Neutrality Acts kept the U.S. from helping out.
Right. Roosevelt must have been frustrated, seeing the danger, but his hands were tied.
It's tragic, really. Then things get even worse. 1938, Germany takes Austria, and then the Munich Agreement. Britain and France basically give Hitler a piece of Czechoslovakia to try and keep him happy.
Appeasement, they called it.
Didn't work out too well, did it? This must have solidified Roosevelt's fears about appeasement and what Hitler was capable of.
It did. But American public opinion still on the side of neutrality.
Hard to imagine what it was like back then. The shadow of WWII still hanging over them. The Depression making life tough. They just didn't want another war.
Understandable. It was this constant tension. Wanting peace, but seeing the world heading down a dangerous path, and that's where things really shift. 1939, World War II breaks out. That changes everything. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2. The U.S. can't stay on the sidelines anymore.
So it's 1939, war is declared, Germany invades Poland, and for the U.S., everything changes. I mean, this war, as terrible as it was, kind of gave Roosevelt the opening he needed to start moving the U.S. away from, strict neutrality.
It did. The war really forced a change. With war declared, Roosevelt finally got Congress to change those Neutrality Acts. Remember, cash and carry? Well, now it applied to weapons, too.
Okay. So countries could buy arms from the U.S. as long as they, paid cash and used their own ships.
You got it.
Clever way to help out countries like Britain and France without actually breaking those neutrality rules.
It was, although, of course, it really only worked for countries with strong navies, right? The ones who could actually get those weapons across the Atlantic.
Right, but they didn't stop there. The Lend-Lease Act, March 1941. Now, that was a game changer.
Oh, yeah. Lend-Lease was huge. It was a massive shift from their earlier policies. Basically, it let the U.S. lend or lease war supplies to any country considered vital to U.S. defense.
And, well, we all know who that mainly benefited, Britain, right?
Right.
They were standing alone against the Nazis after France fell. They needed all the help they could get. Lend-Lease was a lifeline for them, kept them in the fight, while the U.S. was, getting its own military ready.
Absolutely. And in a lot of ways, this marked the end of U.S. neutrality. Even though they weren't officially at war yet, Lend-Lease was a clear sign that they were committed to the Allied cause.
Mr. Hutchings in his podcast talks about this liberal internationalist school of thought, historians like Robert Dallek. They saw this as proof that Roosevelt really believed that America had to take a leading role on the world stage.
Right. They believed that he understood that the U.S. couldn't just sit back and watch democracy crumble. He had to do something.
So, thinking back to those sources you gave us, it's obvious that the U.S. was wrestling with this huge question. How do you balance wanting peace with the need to fight back against fascism?
It's a tough one. And the years between 1933 and 1941 really show that struggle. They cling to neutrality with the Neutrality Acts, then gradually shift towards supporting the Allies. First with cash and carry, then finally with Lend-Lease, like dipping their toes in the water before taking the plunge.
It's amazing how events can change even the most deeply held beliefs. It makes you wonder, what would you have done if you were Roosevelt? Those are some tough decisions.
They were, and it raises a really interesting question. Did the U.S. wait too long to join World War II? Or did Roosevelt's approach, gradually preparing the nation, actually help the Allies win in the end?
That's a question for the historians to debate, something for our listeners to ponder. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I think we should spend some time on the personalities and ideas that really influenced U.S. foreign policy in this era.
Definitely. Those individuals and schools of thought played a huge role in the decisions made during this crucial period.
We're back for the last part of our deep dive, U.S. foreign policy, 1933 to 1941. We've gone from stay out of it to almost joining World War II. Now I think it's time to look closer at some of those key players.
Yeah.
And the ideas that shaped this whole era. I mean, FDR. What a fascinating guy.
He really was, yeah. The sources paint this picture of a president who, well, he understood the danger of fascism, believed in working with other nations, but he was also, practical. He couldn't ignore public opinion or the political situation.
He had to play the game.
Exactly, like a chess master, always thinking a few moves ahead.
And, like we've been talking about, historians have all these different interpretations of how successful he was. The orthodox school, cautious but effective. Revisionists, focus on American interests. Post-revisionists, master strategists playing the long game.
It's amazing, isn't it? Even now, historians are debating his motives, what impact his choices had. Really shows how complicated this time was.
No easy answers. It reminds us that history, well, it's not always black and white. So many different perspectives to consider. And speaking of perspectives, we should talk about those different schools of thought that influenced U.S. foreign policy back then.
Good point. Yeah, let's start with those isolationists. They were all about staying out of Europe's business, a powerful view, especially early on.
Yeah, after World War I, the Depression,
Hmm.
a lot of Americans just wanted to focus on problems at home.
Absolutely. And even within that isolationist group, you had different shades of opinion. Remember the revisionists? Charles Beer, for example. He argued that getting involved in wars, well, in the past, it had mostly helped the wealthy, not everyday Americans.
So for them, it was about protecting ordinary people from being taken advantage of.
Exactly.
Then on the other side, you had the internationalists, believed the U.S. had a duty to promote democracy and freedom all over the world.
Yeah, figures like Woodrow Wilson, even though he was president earlier, his ideas still had a big influence. That vision of a world governed by international law. Cooperation.
A noble idea, but faced a lot of pushback from those isolationists.
It did.
And then there were those who weren't necessarily for jumping into war, but they knew the U.S. couldn't just ignore the threat of fascism.
Yeah, that's where someone like Roosevelt fits in, trying to find ways to help the Allies without, triggering a backlash from the isolationists.
A tough balancing act.
It was.
Wow. So many ideas, so many personalities, all clashing during such a critical time in history. Must have been a period of intense debate, uncertainty, Americans trying to figure out their place in a world that was changing so fast.
And those decisions they made back then, they had a huge impact, not just for the U.S., but for the whole world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway? What should our listeners be thinking about as they reflect on this period?
I think the big question is, how do you balance wanting peace with the responsibility to stand up against threats to freedom? It's a dilemma that we're still facing today, really.
That's a great point. History isn't just about dates and events. It's about these big questions, the ones that challenge us as individuals and as a society.
Absolutely. So as you move forward, think about what we can learn from the past to help us navigate the challenges of today and tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And thanks to everyone for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.